This is Koren. His background is pretty interesting. He is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Minnesota and has some interest in applied economics, and I'm interested to see how all this relates to interstellar travel and exploration. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. This is really cool. It's one of the reasons I became an academic was to do something like that, so it's nice that I actually managed to. My research looks at the kind of, it uses big data to understand the causes of political violence with a focus on forecasting. So how can we not only explain and understand, but also really try to predict it? And so I kind of brought this into this question of, okay, well, how do we think about societies in interstellar travel? And, you know, we have kind of, we don't just want to think of those problems in kind of general terms, really want to be able to predict them in order to better design institutional mechanisms that can help mitigate and prevent some of those issues. And to do so, we really need an empirical approach. We can think of a lot of reasons. Sci-fi offers a lot of great examples of kind of those potential, what life on those spaceships would look like. But, you know, there's an advantage of an empirical data that we can actually say, here's what the data tell us. It's an objective kind of measure. And so, you know, this way we can imagine and come up with an evidence-based kind of strategy of thinking about interstellar travel. So, you know, one thing that it seems like we can safely assume about those interstellar world ships is that they're going to be closed societies. You don't have migration, you don't really have exchange of ideas with the outside world. And as, you know, thinkers from Plato to Popper have already told us, such societies are highly susceptible to conflict, to internal violence, ranging from civil war to repression. And again, we're not talking about small vessels here. It's not the Enterprise, right? We're talking about, I mean, estimates based on the kind of best hopes we can have for speed would be about 1% the speed of light. So we're talking about 10,000s to hundreds of thousands to even millions of people on those vessels. And so taking these issues into account, how can we predict violence prior to sending those ships into space, ex ante, right? And again, using data that we have on Earth, we don't have anything about interstellar travel. And so this paper is kind of a first step in ideally a new agenda. And it tries to kind of think about that, again, with a kind of empirical backing. So there are a lot of types of social conflict on Earth. I'm looking at specifically 4 that have been most prevalent, at least in kind of recent decades. The first one is nonviolent civil disobedience with maximalist aim. So it's different than protests. So like we think of demonstrations, but those things are kind of a higher level. They're designed to actually remove the regime, to remove the government. They're designed to recreate the political system. And again, this is something that, you know, it has some positive aspects, right? 1989 revolutions, etc. But again, on an interstellar vessel, that might be a dangerous form, a destabilizing form of conflict. The second one I'm looking at is coups d'état. So again, we have a small group, usually military officers. So again, something that should be considered within interstellar context, that try to remove the government and take control. Mass killing, that's another pernicious aspect of warfare. So again, it's basically the intentional killing of a large number of individuals, genocides being an extreme form, but we also have violence that is still intentional and massive, but a kind of lower scale. And finally, civil war, the most infamous form of political violence. So we have some group that uses armed means to remove the regime. And so I'm looking at these 4 and trying to kind of focus those. Research has identified a lot of potential predictors. I'm looking at kind of some specific ones. So regime type and political openness is one of them. Food shortages, that's a more recent aspect that I actually work on a lot. Development, state capacity, non-professionalized militaries. So again, we have those officers that might want to remove the regime. History of conflict, availability of natural resources, ethnic cleavages, and other forms of contentious politics. And so, again, we have a lot of those kind of causes. I just take them all and put them in my model, basically. And again, those are among others. There are other things that I did not include. So on really strong predictors of civil war, for example, is baby mortality. But the assumptions would be that people who go on those ships would be relatively healthy, coming from developed countries. Another thing is education. So again, we would expect that people who go on those travel will have at least a high school education. So in this context, those indicators matter less. But again, it's something that worth thinking about. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the data and methods. I originally had way more slides on that. I removed that. If somebody wants, I'd be happy to talk about it more after. But basically, the methods I use here are the same that used by official organizations such as the Presidential Instability Task Force. They use it to predict basically conflicts for the White House and for the CIA. So it's the same methods. Data, there is a lot of big data. I have a lot of observations. It's measured the country year going back 6 decades on all the indicators I just showed and all the kind of conflict types I mentioned. The methods is a combination of statistical and computational approach. I start by estimating a statistical model. I then kind of remove each factor to see how results change, and then I forecast kind of conflict using, again, computational approaches that really kind of play with the data to predict and not just to generate inference. And I do it in 2 phases. I start with just all countries, but then, those interstellar travel world ships there are going to be high-density societies. It's going to be a lot of people. I mean, if anybody here haven't been to Hong Kong or Israel, it's hot, it's humid, everybody's in your face. So some factors become more important in this context. And I want to find exactly those factors that, as we move from just every country to those specific type of society, become really more important. Because that would be the ones that we should be especially concerned about. So as society density increases, we're going to have factors that become more and more important. And again, I'll be happy to talk more about those methods later. So again, I'm running those analyses, and I apologize, it's a bit small, it's hard to see. But here is each one of those conflict types I mentioned earlier. The y-axis is how accurate, so how much each of those factors improve accuracy in the high-density sample, and the x-axis is the full sample. And so, for example, when we look at civil disobedience, we see that political openness, it has some effect in the full sample, right? So it's improves our model accuracy by about 3%, but then it improves it by almost 6 in the high-density sample. So that's something that becomes more important, political openness, as we move to those kind of denser societies. Coups d'etat, so the existence of civil war, again, kind of comes up. And then we see other factors here just don't matter. Some of them actually become kind of worse as you move. Mass killing, so again, the existence of civil war. But here we can see that although it is a strong predictor in both high density and regular societies, it actually plays a more important role in the full sample. So it actually becomes less important with high density societies in terms of mass killing. And then finally, when we look at civil war itself, then we can see, okay, well, economic inequalities become much more important as we move to kind of high density.
What's the unit of the x and y axis and the range?
So basically, I look at country years. So I have about, I think it's 7,800 observations for the full samples and 2,000 for the high density sample. And so I'm going to now talk a bit more about each of those, of the most kind of important ones. So the first factor that really comes out as important, that's something that really improves the accuracy of the model, is political openness. It's a very strong predictor of maximalist civil disobedience. And so when we think of kind of, okay, well, what does this mean? What does it tell us about interstellar travel? So it does suggest that we do want to have an alternative model to the military structure we usually think of, right? So again, I mean, sci-fi or whatever, Star Trek has like officers, you know, a regular vessel, a naval vessel has some sort of a military hierarchical structure where we want to rethink that model a little bit. And it's not that we don't need that structure, right? It's important to have some, especially when you throw a bunch of humans into space, you want to have some form of order, but you want to really set checks and balances on that system. And the kind of best models for that is the idea of constitutional monarchy, right? So like, you know, you think of the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Luxembourg. Those are countries that they have a king, but they're not democracies in the full sense. But they're still relatively very, very free. I mean, they have the highest kind of levels of individual freedoms you can ask for. And so that is kind of a model of constitutional captaincy. That's what I came up with as a term. And so we have this kind of natural stability. There is a structure to it. There is a societal structure. But it's very flexible, and it makes sure that, you know, leaders and officers cannot abuse the power, to kind of overly repress individuals or start their own kind of wars. The second thing I was looking at that came up as important, especially with civil war, is this economic inequalities. So again, this is not necessarily a surprising finding. But it might be a bit challenging when we think about those interstellar warships because we're limited with, we cannot expand our economy physically, right? So on Earth, we basically have, you know, from our perspective, unlimited ability to expand economics. We can build more factories, we can outsource factories. But on those like interstellar ships, you cannot really extend the size of the economy. And you want to make sure that people make enough money, that economic inequalities do not matter as much. And you know, we have a lot of this raw material that we can harvest, but again, putting most people to work so that they can kind of support themselves might be more challenging. And we do want to create economies of scale. So 2 days ago, we went and we saw that rocket factory. And one of the things that amazed me was that they build 12 of those a year, so it's basically artisan work. It's not hammers, but it's close to it. It's kind of large, sizable hammers. It's not automated. It's really, you have this person who sits there and, you know, they kind of walk with the metal. And one of the reasons is because there's no economies of scale in those factories. They basically make 12 of those a year. It's kind of manual thing. And we really want to think of, you want to scale the economy of one of those ships. And one way of doing that is this kind of notion of a virtual economy. Right? So we have companies like Facebook that are very profitable. A lot of people make money through Facebook, but it doesn't really have almost any physical presence. You know, the Instagram model, right? So Instagram comes out, a lot of people can make money by like selling stuff through Instagram. And so the idea is that we kind of want to stimulate consumption, and we want to increase demand and output, and we want to do it by kind of seeking alternative modes of income. And there are issues with that, because a lot of it is going to be informal economy, and that's exactly what the kind of developing world is trying to escape. But again, that's something that could be solved later. Another predictor was ethnic cleavages. Unsurprisingly, it's a strong predictor of civil conflict. Now, you can say, okay, let's just send one ethnicity to space. Well, there are both moral and physical problems with that, right? Physical, because people might, diseases like Tay-Sachs might be an issue. We're going to have genetic limitations. And then there's the moral issue of sending a bunch of basically Ubermenschen into outer space. We don't want to do that. And so an alternative approach is multiculturalism. It's kind of quasi-Canadian model. There are some people in Canada that really push for that. It never really passed. But the idea is that you allow for group traditions, even if sometimes they trump liberal, individual liberties, in order to maintain a group liberty coherence. And now it's kind of anathema to those of us who, in the US, individual freedoms are really above else. But, it is a way of allowing for those multi-ethnicities and allowing for kind of tolerance within that society, within, again, limitation. And there is a lot of discourse on what is good and what is bad in those regards. And again, you want to educate people, of course, like education is another good way of kind of overcoming some of those issues. Another strong predictor was natural disasters. So that's really, we can think about them as broadly as possible as exogenous shocks, right? We're sending those spaceships out there. It's unknown unknowns that's going to kill it, right? We can plan as wide as we want, but it's, it's this asteroid or some form of radiation we're not aware of that might kill us. And the problem with that is you can't plan for it, really. You can't plan for unknowns, black swans, right? You can try to reduce the vulnerability to those issues. So, you can strengthen local system resilience. So you can have kind of a semi-decentralized format of a spaceship, compartmentalization, where if something happens to one side of the ship, it's still not going to affect the others. You can train emergency personnel to be effective, to know how to operate well with the local kind of population within those areas. But again, as I said, those are really limited solutions. And so, another kind of ways of thinking about it moving forward is how to work with some of those issues. And then the final predictor I'm going to talk about here is food supplies. So as we saw 2008, 2011, we see those kind of spikes in food prices. A lot of people take the streets. It kind of feeds into conflict like happened in Syria. And the point about food is that it's not just an issue of production. We can produce enough food, and a lot of people won't be able to access it, right? So Amrita Sen, Nobel Prize laureate, once said that starvation is not about not having enough food. It's about people not being able to have enough food. And so there are a couple of ways you can deal with it. And the key thing is to really think of both a centralized and a decentralized system of food operating at the same time. So you can think of like urban gardening, right? Using all the space you have, kind of like that, those Chinese buildings they're designing to do in order to bottle CO2 emissions. So really kind of maximize the area used to grow food. Another way of thinking about it is, and again, thinking of that kind of system, so you can have a central system of food production that, you can grow cereal, you can grow cattle at the kind of spaceship levels, but that each household will have some form of sustainable individual production. So for example, insects are a great kind of solution. They're very easy and cheap to grow. You don't need anything. One bag of substrate is basically enough for years. There are rich in proteins. And so the idea is that if something happens to the central system, those individual households all over the ship are still able to sustain themselves. And then again, that prevents a lot of those grievances that can arise if something happens to central food production and people don't have enough food. There are other factors. I didn't get into them because they didn't really help much with the accuracy of the models. Something like oil prices, but as I said, they kind of seem to be marginal, at least within that, the framework of that analysis. So some potential limitations with this study behind the obvious ones of using Earth data to try to forecast centuries into the future, into interstellar travel. So the models I use are very specific. Again, they're widely used by those organizations, but there are better models to use. They are more kind of specific or sensitive. More sensitive prediction tools also exist. So again, moving forward, that might be another way of kind of rethinking it. It's trying to calibrate our predictions. And then theoretical. New technology might change politics, right? I mean, Marxism basically is, Marx was a technological writer. He emerges in response to a certain technological change that also has an impact on politics. So that's another thing that, thinking in the future, if we have some brand new big technological development, that might change the way politics happen. And so kind of to conclude, basically what the data tells us about interstellar travel according to the data we have now. So we're going to have a multiculturalist, semi-decentralized, autarkic hybrid of Sweden and Singapore would be the way to think about it, maybe. And again, this is just the new item and a kind of hopefully what's going to be a interesting agenda. So thank you very much.
I'm Greg Matloff, and the question I have for you losing my voice, sorry, deals with your concept of a single ship and an isolated society. And that may come from what Alan Bond and Tony Martin did in their great papers on world ships, but that's not the only way to look at it. You could send a fleet, or the world ship itself could be subdivided as in two rotating cylinders like an O'Neill Model 1 colony. In a case like that, you could have limited contact between the people in one cylinder and another, and that may add to social stability.
No, that's a good point. I mean, I think sending a fleet is it might be a bit more kind of pricier and complicated, but I think the second idea about creating it's basically the same ship, but it's kind of compartmentalized, that I think that would be the idea to think about it. So there is some, but that would still be that those two societies are completely isolated from the, they don't have regular contact with Earth, and that's where it kind of came from. But I completely agree. The notion of a decentralized vessel, I think, is a great one to think of. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Lynch. In the world ships of the future, will there be money?
Well, I mean, if we think of an economy the way we think about it, as I'm mentioning, in a virtual framework, then yeah, I think currency is a crucial way to promote, to not only build economic system, but also social institutions and political institutions. So the way I was approaching it, I was using Earth data. So yeah, the assumption is that currency is, it's highly relevant, but that might change, as I said.
Yeah, well, there's theorists now saying that in the near future here, like, we'll have a minimum wage where everybody, whether they're working or not working, will be getting a minimum. So is that how it would happen maybe in the future?
Well, I mean, again, that might be. As I said, I'm using the Earth data that we have now, and that's not. And so that data reflects the current economic system. It might be, but you still need to have people. So even if you get the minimum wage, you still wanna. A lot of people work, especially in developed countries, because it's part of what fulfills you. So you still need to have those issues. But yeah, I mean, if everybody makes the same, then you can technically, at least theoretically, overcome the issue of economic inequalities. History is pretty ambivalent on whether it's possible.
Doug Loss, when you talk about multiculturalism and ethnic characteristics being able to trump the overall societal characteristics, doesn't that kind of build in the ethnic cleavage that you're trying to mitigate?
Well, that's the thing. So the notion of multiculturalism comes in order to not do that. So the idea is that the way ethnic cleavages usually manifest themselves is when you have either kind of elites that might, at least, again, historically from what we see. So Yugoslavia is a great example. So you have a lot of inter-ethnicity marriages and everything. I mean, until basically the Civil War, it's a fairly, despite the fact that there are a lot of ethnicities, it's still relatively well kind of hanging in the balance. And so what happens is that when you start having kind of elites that manipulate it, then it becomes dangerous. And so the idea of multiculturalism is it allows you kind of trumps, kind of mitigate the effect of such elites. So by being able to really practice and feel more kind of safe within your kind of ethnic practices, even if those might kind of clash with individual rights. And again, there is one of the key things with multiculturalism is that there is a lot of discussion on what you can and can't do with it. That's why it never really caught in Canada. They do have some acts that work really well. I mean, Will Kimlicka is a very famous theorist that has been constantly writing about it, and he advocates for this specific approach. And I'm not saying that you need to go all the way like this, but the idea of multiculturalism in essence is to exactly take the stuff that could, boil and somehow distribute it by letting people kind of feel more relaxed in what they do. Yeah.
Some research at Ames and elsewhere has shown that isolated groups function more smoothly if there is a gender imbalance with more women than men. And I was wondering whether this could be manipulated biologically so that more girls were born than boys, and it might improve domestic peace.
That's an interesting. That was not in my data or my theories, but that's not a bad notion. I mean, I would be happy to be on a ship like that.
Given the post-EU history, European Union history of Turkey, do you have any concerns about including an Ataturk-style policies in your conclusion and recommendations?
So, like, do you mean, so the whole notion of Ataturk is exactly that. It's stripping the whole notion of, it basically uses the institutions of the state to trump individual practices. And the idea of, that's the notion of multiculturalism, is that it limits the state's ability or the society's ability to do that. So again, we go back to, this is just a strategy that I kind of thought about and read about to mitigate it. There are a lot of ways of thinking about ethnic cleavages. I mean, education in and of itself is already a great way to kind of overcoming some of those issues. So I mean, I think that, yeah, I do think that you might want to think a bit about the, like the Ataturk policies of completely separating. And I mean, we see what's happening now, right? It's kind of making a comeback, and you don't want that to happen when you're stuck in space. So yeah, it's a good point.
Yep. George Hathaway. What's the notion in your model of self-policing or policing from a different group within the society? I'm talking about, presumably there will be laws or methods of maintaining the peace, but they are likely to be, according to the model so far, just endogenous. Are there any ideas that you have had with regard to policing or maintaining the peace exogenously? I don't mean from outside the ship, but I mean from a group of either humans or non-humans made up of the travelers.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, one of the reasons I used predictive methods rather than just kind of sheer statistical stuff is because they're much better with endogeneity. So if you're just looking at forecasting, then it doesn't matter if things are endogenous or not. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the idea of thinking of this constitutional monarchy model should help with some of that stuff, because you do have this exogenous structure, right? This is the power structure that is, it has a captain, it has those officers, but at the same time, you want to really like place some checks on those powers, and that does make it endogenous. I mean, that literally introduces huge amount of endogeneity into that, both the theory and the model. So I don't know what to say about that. I do think that, you know, those are one of those things that you want to, again, kind of future research might need to think more about, especially the policing kind of side, because, you know, it's how you prevent, it is kind of a very hard balance to achieve, yeah.
Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.